Chapter 1. The picnic at Maple Hollow. It was, by all accounts, the loveliest day of the summer. The sun had climbed to a courteous height, not so high as to overheat the guests, nor so low as to cast any unwelcome gloom. The villagers of Maple Hollow, in their wide-brimmed hats and starched linen, had gathered on the green behind the parish church for the annual Preservation of Village Traditions picnic, a beloved event that doubled as both a charitable fundraiser and a subtle contest in social manoeuvring. Miss Jane Marple, a quiet presence under the shade of a striped parasol, was watching it all with a practised eye. "Another cucumber sandwich, dear," offered Mrs. Bantry, settling beside her with a plate already heaped with sausage rolls and raspberry sponge. "No, thank you," Miss Marple replied mildly, "though I must say the crusts have been cut very evenly this year. I believe Mrs. Mellor has passed that task to her new housemaid." Mrs. Bantry chuckled. "Isn't it strange what you notice? I was only looking at the way Mr. Northwood wears his shoes, expensive, polished daily, but scuffed at the heel, like a man used to retreating." Miss Marple looked toward the solitary figure on the far edge of the green. Mr. Julian Northwood stood with a lemonade in one hand, his back half turned to the festivities. He wore a grey linen jacket with subtle elbow patches, and his expression, while not unfriendly, had the detached air of a man who had agreed to attend something against his better judgment. He had only lived in Maple Hollow for 3 months, taking residence in the old Crowsley cottage, a modest ivy-wrapped house left vacant since Miss Lydia Eyre, a painter of questionable acclaim, had passed away the year prior. Since his arrival, he had kept largely to himself, refusing several social invitations, including the vicar's supper, the Historical Society's spring talk, and even the local bridge club's open evening, which was generally considered unmissable. Rumours, as they do in villages, had begun at once. "He's a writer," one said, "and a good one too, published under another name." "No, no," said another, "he's been sent away. Something legal, something hush-hush." The hands of a pianist, Miss Hargreaves the librarian had declared, but the eyes of a man who's seen something dreadful. It was in this atmosphere of speculation and gentle hospitality that the picnic unfolded. Children darted through the grass, ladies arranged cakes on collapsible tables, and Colonel Braithwaite, recently retired and growing rather deaf, barked about the lack of clotted cream in tones loud enough to startle sparrows. Croquet was under way, and the church bell had been rung twice for effect. Mr. Northwood, after being persuaded by Mrs. Mellor, took part in one round of croquet, smiled politely at his defeat, and retreated to the shade of a tree, where he appeared to write in a small black notebook. Miss Marple watched this with interest. "Odd, isn't it?" murmured Mrs. Bantry, adjusting her sun hat. "He chooses today, of all days, to suddenly show himself, after avoiding everyone since March." "Perhaps he simply decided to observe the locals in their natural habitat," Miss Marple replied with a glint of amusement. "Do you think he's hiding something?" Miss Marple didn't answer right away. She watched as Northwood walked toward the refreshment table, accepted a glass of lemonade, and then paused as though deciding whether to stay longer or vanish again. "I think, Dolly," she said softly, "that some people hide not because they are dangerous, but because they are in danger." Before Mrs. Bantry could respond, a sharp cry split the air. It came from behind the croquet set. A scattering of voices followed, startled, rising in pitch. and then, unmistakably, a scream. Someone's collapsed. The words cut through the picnic like a sudden thunderclap. Guests turned. Children froze mid-run. A few plates clattered to the grass. Miss Marple stood slowly, gathering her handbag with care. "Come, Dolly," she said. "I believe something rather serious has occurred." They reached the scene in time to see Mr. Julian Northwood stretched on the grass, his grey jacket splayed like wings, one hand clutching at his shirt front. A ring of guests had formed, keeping a respectful distance, but not without a keen sense of curiosity. The vicar had knelt beside him and was muttering prayers. The village doctor, Dr. Leonard, pushed through the crowd, his black case in hand, and his face already grim. Miss Marple stood quietly at the back. "What happened?" she asked Mrs. Tewkesbury, who had witnessed it all. "He was just standing." "There," said Mrs. Tewkesbury breathlessly. "Then he gave a little stagger, dropped his glass, and fell. Didn't say a word." Dr. Leonard was kneeling now, feeling for a pulse, then checking the man's pupils. After a moment he rose and cleared his throat. "I'm afraid Mr. Northwood is dead." A gasp rippled through the crowd. "Hart, do you think?" asked Colonel Braithwaite, already frowning at the remains of the lemonade glass. "Possibly," said the doctor, but his eyes didn't move from the body. "Though I'll have to examine him further. There's no sign of trauma, no known condition, no family on record either, as far as I know." Miss Marple said nothing, but she saw it, a faint wet ring where the glass had dropped, a sliver of lemon still floating in the grass, and most curiously, a wasp hovering near the rim of the cup. Hovering, but not drinking. By the time the constable from Lower Winterfield arrived, the body had been covered, and the picnic was quietly but firmly dispersed. Tables were packed away, cakes left uneaten. The sun, unbothered by the affair, shone just as brightly. Miss Marple returned to her seat beneath the umbrella and folded her hands in her lap. "It's strange," she murmured. "What is?" asked Mrs. Bantry, still pale from the shock. "Drank only a few sips," Miss Marple said, "but it was enough." "You think he was poisoned?" Miss Marple looked ahead, her expression calm. "I think," she said gently, "that Mr. Julian Northwood was not meant to be here today, and someone intended to make sure he never came again." Chapter 2. The Village Reacts. The death of Mr. Julian Northwood had, within hours, become the only subject of conversation in Maple Hollow. By the following morning, the quaint village had transformed into a hub of quietly contained hysteria, though, naturally, being English, no one used such impolite terms. Instead, people spoke of shock and most unfortunate events, while slipping between shops, doorways, and telephone wires with eyes wide and ears sharper than usual. At the High Street tea shop, Mrs. Edith Mellor was seated at her customary corner table flanked by her bridge partner, Miss Gwendolen Pratt, and a pot of Earl Grey that had gone untouched for nearly 20 minutes. "I was the one who handed him the lemonade," Mrs. Mellor declared, her voice low but pointed, as if daring someone to question the gravity of her role. "The very glass. And I remember it clearly, green tumbler, fresh slice of lemon, same as always." Miss Pratt looked suitably impressed. "And he didn't say anything? No complaint, no cough?" "Not a word," Mrs. Mellor whispered. "Drank it, thanked me, and walked away. 10 minutes later, dead. The table fell into a reverent silence. Across the street, the vicar was paying a surprise visit to Dr. Leonard, hoping for more clarity than what had been offered to the general public. "Well, was it his heart?" Reverend Lyon asked, lowering his voice as though the answer might be scandalous. Dr. Leonard, a man of habitual discretion, shook his head. "I wouldn't rule out poisoning," he said carefully. "The symptoms don't fit a heart attack. No clutching, no grimace, no history of angina. He simply folded." Reverend Lyon frowned. "And the police? They've sent for the coroner, and the county inspector is due in the morning. Constable Phelps is trying his best, but—" He trailed off, his meaning clear. Young Phelps had only dealt with bicycles and missing ducks. A sudden death at a public gathering was rather above his pay grade. Back at her cottage on Church Lane, Miss Marple was already seated at her desk, going over the details in her notebook. The entries were as follows: Julian Northwood, newcomer, solitary, faintly arrogant, recent resident of Crowsley Cottage, private, possibly a writer, no known, family or ties, died after drinking lemonade, no visible signs of trauma, possible poisoning. She tapped her pencil gently on the corner of the page. It was the glass that interested her most. Mrs. Mellor had served it, but she hadn't prepared it. The refreshments were being managed by 3 others that day: Jenny Leach, the baker's daughter; Toby Winchcombe, a teenage volunteer with a tendency to sample what he served; and lastly, Nora Braithwaite, niece of the Colonel, and a young woman with the unfortunate distinction of being both painfully shy and frequently overlooked. 3 people who had access to the lemonade. 3 people who had touched the glasses. Before the guests did, she circled their names. Later that afternoon, the coroner arrived from Market Wexford, along with Inspector Howard Dunning from the county force, a tall, gravel-voiced man with a face like weathered sandstone, and no apparent love for rural courtesies. He set up in the vicarage library, using Reverend Lyon's writing desk for his notes, and requesting a list of all attendees at the picnic. Miss Marple, who had politely introduced herself as a long-time resident with a modest interest in village affairs, offered to help reconstruct the guest list. Her offer, met with initial skepticism, was quickly accepted when she recalled every household present and in which order they'd arrived. "You've quite the memory, ma'am," Dunning said, raising an eyebrow as she recited the names without hesitation. "One collects details with age, Inspector," Miss Marple replied with a soft smile. "They tend to stay better than birthdays or bank statements." By early evening, the coroner confirmed what she had already suspected. There were traces of aconite, he announced solemnly, in Mr. Northwood's system. Common name, monkshood, highly toxic, fast-acting. A shiver seemed to pass through the room. Reverend Lyon paled. "But that's a garden flower." "Indeed," Dunning muttered. "Quite common. Easy to mistake for something else, unless, of course, one knows precisely what they're doing." Miss Marple didn't speak. She was looking instead at the small group gathered behind the inspector. Mrs. Mellor, visibly pale; Jenny Leach, blinking rapidly; young Toby, chewing a fingernail until his aunt smacked his hand down; and Nora Braithwaite, standing rigid, her eyes fixed firmly on the floor. None of them seemed surprised. That was curious. After supper, Miss Marple paid a call to Mrs. Bantry. The Bantry house was one of the few in the village that had both a drawing-room and a staff that still wore gloves. Though no longer grand by county standards, it held onto its dignity like a widow with excellent posture. Miss Marple was greeted by the butler and shown to the fire, where Mrs. Bantry awaited with a knitted shawl and a shrewd look. "Well," she said, "you've a face full of theories." Miss Marple nodded slightly. "Not theories yet, just threads." "Then tell me the threads." Miss Marple leaned forward. "Someone poisoned Mr. Northwood in broad daylight. That requires confidence or desperation. Either way, it wasn't a random act. This was personal." Mrs. Bantry poured the tea. "You think someone knew him from before? Or he knew something they didn't want revealed?" She stirred her cup thoughtfully. "I watched him walk alone through a crowd of 200 people and not speak with more than 3. He was being polite, but distant. And when Mrs. Mellor offered him the drink, he hesitated for the briefest second, enough to suggest he was watching his surroundings carefully." "You think he suspected something?" "I think," Miss Marple said softly, "he expected to die." Mrs. Bantry blinked. "You believe he knew?" Miss Marple shook her head. "No, not knew, but feared. And fear leaves a trail, Dolly. Always." She rose from her chair and fastened her shawl. "I'm going to speak with the gardener at Crowsley Cottage tomorrow morning. Monkshood may be common, but the hand that harvests it never is." Chapter 3. Among the Monkshood. The next morning dawned with a damp stillness, the kind that made the stone paths of Maple Hollow glisten and the roses droop slightly at the tips. A gentle fog lingered between the cottages, curling in the hollows, and rising lazily past chimney-pots. The village, though still buzzing in hushed tones about the picnic tragedy, had returned to its careful rhythm. Windows washed, post delivered, and gossip subtly folded into every errand. Miss Marple, having finished her breakfast of boiled egg and toast fingers, tied her scarf neatly beneath her chin and set out along Crowsley Lane. She walked at her usual unhurried pace, umbrella tapping softly on the cobbles, until the ivy-wrapped roofline of Crowsley Cottage came into view. It was a modest property by village standards. 2 stories, brick-faced, with a low iron gate and garden that had once been orderly, but now hinted at gentle neglect. Roses tangled near the front steps, and the hydrangeas had gone slightly wild. But there, beneath the bay window, stood the flower bed Miss Marple had most wanted to see, the monkshood. Its violet-blue blossoms were still full. The petals curved like cowls, beautiful, deadly, and undeniably well-tended. Miss Marple pushed open the gate. She was greeted by the gardener, Tom Harker, a wiry man in his late 40s with a face like a weather-worn fence-post and a cap he never removed, even indoors. He had been employed by Miss Lydia Eyre in her final years, and had stayed on to assist Mr. Northwood once the new tenant had moved in. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said, wiping his hands on a rag as he saw her approach. "Come to see the mess. Yourself, have you?" "I've come to see the flowers," she said pleasantly, gesturing toward the monkshood. "Aconitum napellus. Quite rare to see it blooming this late in the season." Tom raised a brow. "You know your plants." "A lifelong interest," she replied. "Tell me, Did Mr. Northwood care much for the garden?" "Not particularly," Tom said, frowning. "Didn't touch it himself, but he asked me to keep it neat. Said the flowers helped him think. I trimmed the hedges and left the rest alone. And the monk's hood, was it already here?" Tom hesitated. It was. Miss Eyre planted it. Odd woman she was. Said it kept the cats away. Miss Marple crouched gently, inspecting the soil around the base. No signs of recent disturbance. She stood brushing off her skirt. "Mr. Northwood didn't ask you to remove it?" "No, ma'am, though he asked what it was." "And did you tell him it was poisonous?" Tom nodded. "Sure did. He just stared at it for a bit and said, 'Good to know.' Gave me a chill, that did." Miss Marple turned toward the house. The windows were shut, the curtains drawn. She could still picture Mr. Northwood standing there, hands in his pockets, watching the garden while keeping the world at bay. "Thank you, Tom," she said. "That's all I needed." But she was already thinking. Mr. Northwood had known what monkshood was. He'd asked, registered the danger. So why would a man who knew the potency of the plant drink from a cup that smelled faintly of it, unless he hadn't known at all? Or worse, unless someone had found a way to disguise it. Later that morning, Miss Marple paid a brief visit to the village pharmacy, run by Mr. Peter Denham, a former army medic with a clipped moustache and a habit of speaking in short declarative bursts. He greeted her warmly. "Miss Marple, always a pleasure. I wanted to inquire," she said, peering at a shelf of labelled bottles, "whether anyone has recently purchased tincture of aconite." Denham blinked. "Highly restricted. Not sold over the counter. Only physicians and licensed herbalists may carry it." "And yet," Miss Marple said mildly, "aconite can be harvested in any number of gardens in this very village." He frowned. "Yes, but preparing it into something ingestible, something fatal, requires knowledge. This isn't your average poison. It's dangerous even to handle." Miss Marple smiled. "Which narrows the suspect pool to those with curiosity and courage. Or arrogance," Denham added. "Quite right," she murmured. That afternoon, as she made her way past the post office, Miss Marple encountered young Nora Braithwaite, the Colonel's niece, walking with her arms crossed and a stack of library books clutched protectively to her chest. "Nora, dear," Miss Marple called, "might I have a word?" Nora stopped, blinking nervously. "Yes, Miss Marple." They stood just outside the baker's window, steam rising inside from fresh loaves. "You were assisting with refreshments at the picnic, weren't you?" Nora nodded. "And did you prepare the lemonade table?" "Yes, but mostly Jenny did. I just handed out cups." "And did you notice anything strange that day? Any arguments, any exchanges?" Nora hesitated. "Only one thing. But it's probably nothing." "Those are often the most useful kind," Miss Marple said gently. Nora leaned in. "Just before it happened. Mr. Northwood, I mean. I saw him talking to Mrs. Larch." Miss Marple's brows lifted slightly. "Mrs. Larch? I thought she'd left early. She did. But before she did, she went up to him. She looked very pale. I only saw them from a distance, but she handed him something. I thought it was a note." "And what did he do?" "He looked at it, then put it in his pocket. A few minutes later, he was gone." Miss Marple placed a hand on Nora's arm. "You've been very helpful. Mrs. Larch, Margaret Larch, was a quiet widow of some standing in the village. known more for her conservatory and floral arrangements than anything scandalous. But Miss Marple remembered now. She had once lived in London, and her late husband had been a solicitor. Had Mr. Northwood known her before? Had she known him? The pieces had not yet fallen into place, but they had begun to lean toward each other, and Miss Marple felt that particular stillness she always felt when a puzzle began to speak. That evening she returned to her sitting room, notebook open, beside her, and stared at the fireplace for a long time. The fire crackled gently, casting flickers of shadow on the wallpaper. She turned a fresh page and wrote a single sentence. The lemonade was the method, but the motive remains hidden in the folds of the past. She set her pen down, her eyes thoughtful, and tomorrow she would pay a visit to Mrs. Larch. Chapter 4. Tea and Testimony. The Larch residence, a whitewashed bungalow tucked just beyond the high street, sat quietly behind a curtain of lilac and honeysuckle. To the untrained eye, it was indistinguishable from any of the other prim and polite homes lining Lavender Row. But to Miss Marple it radiated a certain tension, as if the house, like its mistress, was waiting for something to pass unnoticed. She arrived just past 11 with a jar of marmalade and a purpose tucked neatly under her arm. Mrs. Margaret Larch, a woman of discreet middle age with neatly waved hair and the kind of smile that had learned how to hide a trembling lip, greeted her with faint surprise and immediate politeness. "Miss Marple, how lovely! What a kind surprise! And I thought you might be in need of something sweet," Miss Marple said, handing over the marmalade. "It's my own Seville orange." "How thoughtful! Do come in." The sitting room was immaculate, as always, and the tea set was all ready, laid out as if expecting a guest, though Mrs. Larch did not mention one. She moved with poise, though her eyes flickered toward the clock more than once during their first few minutes of pleasantries. Miss Marple, never one to rush such matters, sipped her tea and asked after the dahlias, which were indeed thriving. Only after a sufficient lull did she say, as if remembering a casual trifle, "I do hope you weren't too upset by what happened at the picnic." Mrs. Larch's teacup paused mid-air, just for a second. "It was dreadful," she said. "Quite dreadful. I still can't believe it. I only spoke to Mr. Northwood briefly. He seemed so composed. Did you know him before he came to Maple Hollow?" There was the slightest hesitation. No, I don't believe so. Although there is something vaguely familiar about him. A mannerism, perhaps." Miss Marple nodded. Some people carry their past like perfume, faint but lingering. Mrs. Larch gave a forced little laugh, but her fingers tightened slightly around the teacup handle. "You were seen speaking with him that afternoon," Miss Marple continued gently. "Just before, well." Mrs. Larch's smile wavered. "I gave him a note," she said at last. "I see," Miss Marple said calmly. "And what was in the note?" There was a long silence. Then, nothing of consequence. It was about a legal matter. He'd asked me, quietly, not to speak of it. Something about a manuscript. A will. A will? Mrs. Larch set down her cup. He claimed to have information regarding a change in a will. A prominent family in London, he said. Something fraudulent. He asked for my advice, given my late husband's profession. And did you give it? I told him to leave it alone. That if he had no proof, he'd be endangering himself. Miss Marple leaned forward ever so slightly. And did he say who the will involved? No, Mrs. Larch whispered, but he looked frightened. That's why I left the picnic early. I didn't want to be seen with him again. Because someone might think you were involved? Mrs. Larch stared at her for a long moment. Then, softly, because someone already did. When Miss Marple returned to her cottage, she found a note slipped under her door. The paper was rough, torn from a ledger, and the writing was uneven, pressed too hard with a blunt pencil. He knew about Elmsley House. Ask Jenny. There was no signature, no indication of who had delivered it. But Elmsley House, now there was a name Miss Marple hadn't heard in years. It had once been a grand estate on the edge of Lower Winterfield, owned by the Collingridge family, wealthy, reclusive, and scandal-rumoured for decades. The house had burned partially during a storm 10 years ago, and the remaining structure was sold off in parts. Rumours had swirled about lost deeds, hidden money, and a vanished heir. Miss Marple tapped the paper against her fingers, her mind already spinning the thread. She would need to speak to Jenny Leach, the baker's daughter, and one of the lemonade servers. But first, she needed a walk and a visit to the vicar. Reverend Lyon received her kindly in the church garden, where he was tending a bed of underwhelming petunias. I hoped you might clarify something, Miss Marple said. Did Mr. Northwood ever express interest in the Collingridge family? The vicar raised his head. Not directly, no, though I do recall him requesting a look through the church archive, births and deaths. Said he was writing something about inheritance, thought it might help with background texture, he called it. Did he mention Elmsley House? Once, in passing. He said he'd heard a story about a missing heir, that a name had been erased from a family Bible. Miss Marple folded her arms. And was it true? The vicar's brow furrowed. There is a Collingridge Bible in the archives, yes, though I've never looked closely at the entries. I would like to see it. They retrieved the volume from the vestry cabinet, a weighty thing, bound in leather, its pages foxed and brittle. Miss Marple turned to the family pages. There, a list of births, neat and tidy, until 1907. Then a curious gap, a faint indentation where a name had once been, the ink scraped, erased. Someone had deliberately removed a child from record. Curious, Reverend Lyon murmured. Tragic, Miss Marple corrected. To be born, named, and then removed. Later that day, she paid a visit to Jenny Leach, who was just finishing deliveries for the bakery. Jenny, bright-cheeked and perpetually harried, looked surprised to see her. I only need a moment, Miss Marple said kindly. It's about the picnic and the lemonade. Jenny hesitated, then nodded. What do you want to know? Did Mr. Northwood say anything to you? Ask you anything unusual? Jenny bit her lip. Not really, though. He did ask if the drinks were being served to anyone special. Seemed to want a certain glass. A certain glass? He asked for the green tumbler, said it reminded him of something. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. And did anyone else request that glass? Jenny nodded. Yes, Mr. Braithwaite, Nora's uncle. Colonel Braithwaite. Now that was interesting. That evening, as the rain began to fall lightly on the rooftops of Maple Hollow, Miss Marple returned home and wrote out the thread so far. Julian Northwood connected to a missing heir. Monk's hood in the lemonade. Poison carefully prepared. will or manuscript related to Elmsley House. Braithwaite requested the same glass. Nora's behaviour, tense, alert. Anonymous note, he knew. And at the bottom, one final question. Was Mr. Northwood trying to reveal someone else's secret, or reclaim his own? Chapter 5. A Portrait in Ashes. Miss Marple rose early the next morning, her mind unusually burdened by possibility. The threads of Mr. Northwood's death had begun to twist around something older, something nearly forgotten by the village, but not by time. A missing heir, a glass passed from hand to hand, a note with no name, but too much meaning. It all pointed to the same unsettling truth. This was not a murder of passion. It was a murder of prevention. She sat at her writing desk with a steaming cup of tea and opened her notebook. At the top she wrote, Elmsley House, Collingridge lineage, missing name, Braithwaite connection. Then, beneath that, green tumbler, requested by Braithwaite, used by Northwood, switched perhaps. She underlined it twice. Poisonings at village. Picnics were not unheard of in fiction, but in life they demanded a peculiar combination of confidence and precision. This was not the act of someone panicking. It was an act of calm design, planned with knowledge of the ingredients, the setting, and perhaps most dangerously, the people. By mid-morning, Miss Marple had made her way to the Braithwaite residence, an ageing manor on the north edge of the village with ivy crawling up one side like a dark secret. Colonel James Braithwaite answered the door himself, still in his housecoat, and regarded Miss Marple with the wary courtesy of someone unsure whether he was being honoured or interrogated. Miss Marple, he said gruffly, to what do I owe the pleasure? I was hoping for a word, Colonel, regarding the picnic. He frowned, stepped back, and gestured her inside. The drawing-room was all heavy drapery, and the faint scent of cigar smoke. Nora was seated near the window, reading a book with more attention than comprehension. She stood quickly when Miss Marple entered. "Do sit, Jane," the Colonel said. "I can't imagine you've come about sponge cake." "No, Miss Marple," said gently. "I've come about the lemonade." The Colonel raised an eyebrow. Strange business, that. Poor fellow just dropped. And now all this poison talk. Dashed unpleasant. "You requested a specific glass, I understand?" she asked, tone mild. His face barely flickered. "I asked for the green one. Habit. Hate those see-through things. Always feel like you're drinking from a jam jar." Miss Marple nodded. "Of course. And Mr. Northwood also asked for that tumbler. Did he?" The Colonel's tone was too casual. "Well, no accounting for taste. You knew him, didn't you?" she asked softly, "before he came to Maple Hollow." The room seemed to tense around them. Nora shifted slightly in her seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Braithwaite's eyes narrowed. Never set eyes on the man before May. "But you knew of him." He didn't answer. The silence was long enough to answer for him. Miss Marple turned to Nora. "Did you know he was coming, my dear?" Nora's lips parted, but no sound came. Miss Marple's voice remained kind. "You see, he wasn't just a stranger. He was someone who carried a history no one wanted remembered. And sometimes history walks back in when we least expect it." Nora's eyes filled with tears. She looked down at her lap. The Colonel rose abruptly. "I think this line of questioning is enough, Miss Marple." She stood too, with calm dignity. "It very nearly is, Colonel." Later that day, she took a walk to Lower Winterfield. The ruins of Elmsley House sat at the edge of the village like a broken crown, its west wing gutted by fire, its east wing sold to developers who had never managed to complete their plans. The chapel remained intact, though locked. She stood before the old iron gates and peered through at the blackened stone and tangled ivy. According to parish records, the last Collingridge child to be baptized at Elmsley had vanished from the books before reaching adulthood. No death recorded, no marriage, only that scraped name in the family Bible. What if Julian Northwood had been that child? What if, after years away, adopted, perhaps, or hidden, he had returned to reclaim what had been erased? And what if someone had benefited very handsomely from his absence? She turned from the gates and walked back to the lane. There was one person left who might have known, someone whose age and discretion had been overlooked entirely. Old Mrs. Drew, the housekeeper at Elmsley House in its final years, now resided in a cottage in Gorse Hollow. She was frail but sharp-eyed, and Miss Marple had always found her more observant than most gave her credit for. She welcomed Miss Marple with a wide smile and a kettle ready on the boil. "Miss Marple! Now, this is a day worth noting. Come in, come in." They spoke of the weather, of the rising cost of butter, and of village matters before Miss Marple carefully steered the conversation. "Did you know Mr. Northwood?" she asked gently. Drew blinked. "He came to see me, you know, last month. Said he had questions about Elmsley House." Miss Marple leaned forward. "Did he say who he was?" Mrs. Drew's eyes twinkled. "Didn't need to. Same eyes as his mother. Same voice, too. I knew the moment I saw him." "So he was Jonathan Collingridge," she whispered, "the youngest. They sent him away after the scandal." "What scandal?" Mrs. Drew's face darkened. "There was a dispute. Old man Collingridge changed his will, cut James Braithwaite's sister out of it. Said she was only interested in the estate. She vanished, but not before swearing she'd see the boy gone." Miss Marple felt a slow chill rise in her spine. "And did she?" Mrs. Drew nodded. "Took him to France, they said, or Scotland. Never heard again. But I always wondered. Now she knew. He had returned, and someone had made certain he didn't stay." That night, Miss Marple sat by her fire, notebook open, Julian Northwood, Dakiches, Jonathan Collingridge removed as heir to protect fraudulent inheritance. Braithwaite family gained control of estate. Motive: to prevent legal challenge. Glass: intended for Braithwaite? Switched? Or was Northwood the target all along? She folded her hands. The puzzle was nearly complete. Only one piece remained. Who had done it, and why? Now, tomorrow, she would begin her final test. Chapter 6. A Question of Glass. The next morning broke crisp and still, the air sharp with the scent of wet earth and chimney smoke. Maple Hollow, outwardly calm, was beginning to show signs of inward strain. Conversations lingered too long in the grocer's shop. The vicar fumbled his homilies. Even the postman, normally cheerfully whistling, walked a little faster between doorsteps. Miss Marple, however, moved with her usual steady rhythm. her thoughts turning not only to who had killed Julian Northwood, but who had nearly failed. Because the more she considered it, the more she wondered, was Julian Northwood even the intended victim at all? She recalled again what Jenny Leach had said, that Colonel Braithwaite had requested the green tumbler first, that Mr. Northwood had requested it afterward, that they were both seen within minutes of each other near the refreshments table. The green tumbler. It was a simple glass, indistinct to most, but in a village where so little changed, even the smallest object gained meaning. Miss Marple tied her shawl, pinned her hat, and stepped out once more, this time toward the bakery, where Jenny Leach had just begun her day's work. The bell above the door chimed as Miss Marple entered, bringing with her the scent of morning and old violets. Jenny glanced up from behind the counter, dusting flour from her apron. "Miss Marple, more tea cakes this week." "In a moment, dear. I've come to ask something else. Something about that picnic glass." Jenny blinked. "Oh, the green one again. Yes. Do you recall who handled it last before it was set on the table?" Jenny looked thoughtful. "Nora Braithwaite brought it from the crate. I remember because she said it looked old-fashioned and nearly took a different one." "But she didn't?" Jenny shook her head. "No, said Colonel Braithwaite preferred it, so she set it aside for him." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "And what happened after that?" "I turned my back to refill the punch. When I turned around again, both Nora and the glass were gone. Then Mr. Northwood appeared a minute later and took it. Without asking, he just picked it up, said something about it being familiar. And you're quite sure she placed the correct glass on the table?" Jenny hesitated. "Well, now that you say it, I thought it was the green one, but it might have been another. I was busy, you see." Miss Marple nodded. "Thank you, dear. You've helped a great deal." The next stop was the Braithwaite house. Colonel Braithwaite was not at home, off, supposedly, to the solicitor's office in Lower Winterfield, but Nora was, pale, drawn, and clearly not sleeping well. She opened the door with a hesitant smile. "Miss Marple," she said softly, "please come in." They sat in the morning room, the curtains drawn halfway. On the table beside them lay an untouched embroidery hoop and a book turned face down. Nora looked exhausted. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began quietly, "about the past." "And about the glass," Miss Marple prompted. Nora stiffened. "I didn't mean for it to happen, I swear." Miss Marple's voice remained soft. "Then tell me what did." Nora took a shaky breath. "My uncle was afraid. Julian Northwood had written to him, privately, said he was going to contest the Collingridge inheritance, that he had proof. Uncle dismissed it at first, but when he showed up in the village, it became real." "Did your uncle ask you to do anything?" "No, not directly. But I knew what it meant if Jonathan Collingridge, Julian, came forward. The estate would go, the house, the name." Miss Marple studied her. "So you prepared the glass?" Nora's voice was barely above a whisper. "No, I only moved it." "Moved it? I didn't want to kill anyone, Miss Marple. But I knew Uncle would be served that glass. And when I saw it on the table, alone, I took it. Just for a moment, I meant to swap it later. But then Julian came, and he took it first." Miss Marple's expression didn't change, and you said nothing. I thought—" Nora's eyes filled with tears. "I thought maybe it wasn't real. Maybe it was just old lemonade, that nothing would happen." "But it did," Miss Marple said gently, "because someone else had seen that the green glass would go to Julian." Nora looked up, startled. "Someone else?" Miss Marple rose. "Thank you, dear. You've told me exactly what I needed to know." That evening, Inspector Dunning arrived at Miss Marple's request. She greeted him at the gate with her usual calm demeanour and ushered him into the parlour where tea had already been set. "Is this about your theory?" he asked, setting his hat aside. "It is," she said, "and I believe I'm ready to name the murderer." Dunning sat forward. "It wasn't Nora," she began. "She moved the poisoned glass out of panic, not malice. It was already meant for Julian Northwood. Someone else placed the aconite in it, carefully, knowing exactly how the refreshments would be handled. Who? Someone with access to monkshood," Miss Marple said. "Someone who knew how to prepare it. Someone who would not be suspected." She reached for a slip of paper and handed it to Dunning. It read, "Peter Denham, pharmacist." Dunning stared at it. "The chemist?" "Yes," she said. He spoke to Julian about a manuscript. Julian thought he could trust him. Denham, I believe, had access to the Collingridge records through his brother, a former solicitor in London. When Julian returned, Denham realised he stood to lose quite a sum, likely blackmail payments for silence over the years. Dunning's brow furrowed. And the motive? Denham was not only privy to the will, but likely involved in the alteration of records. He knew Julian would bring proof. He knew that if the inheritance scandal came to light, his name might surface too. Julian trusted him enough to discuss legal steps. Denham used that trust and added poison to the glass. He knew Julian would seek out. Dunning stared into his tea. "We'll need proof." Miss Marple smiled gently. "He keeps a private log in the back of his pharmacy. Ask to see the stock list. He noted the monkshood extract 3 weeks ago. He thought no one noticed." She leaned back. "But someone always notices." Chapter 7. The turn of the screw Inspector Dunning was not a man to dawdle. By midday the next day, he had arrived at the Maple Hollow pharmacy under the pretext of a routine inquiry regarding controlled substances in stock. Mr. Peter Denham greeted him with the same clipped civility he reserved for most of the village, though his jaw tightened ever so slightly at the sight of a police badge. "Of course, Inspector," Denham said, wiping his hands on a cloth. "All my ledgers are in order." "I'm sure they are," Dunning replied. "I'd simply like to have a look at your recent stocks, particularly herbal extracts, for formality's sake." Denham led him behind the counter to the rear storeroom, where rows of brown glass bottles and labelled drawers stood in fastidious alignment. He produced a leather-bound inventory book and opened it with a slight flourish. Dunning scanned the list. Chamomile, foxglove, belladonna, and there it was. Aconitum, tincture, 12 ml, removed for heating, not for sale. Internal Prep Dunning tapped the entry with his finger. "What's this note?" Denham's expression flickered. "I prepared a sample tincture weeks ago, purely for botanical study. It was never sold or used." "But you heated it?" "It's necessary for proper distillation," Denham said, smoothly. "Again, not for ingestion. It was destroyed after." Dunning closed the ledger. "I'd still like to keep this, just to be thorough." Denham hesitated, then offered a short nod. "If you insist." Outside, Dunning met Miss Marple under the guise of an accidental encounter. She was, as usual, on her way to deliver a basket of jam to the church bake sale. "He's nervous," Dunning muttered. "Of course he is," Miss Marple said. "Guilt rarely wears a composed face forever." Dunning gave a tight smile. "What would you suggest I do now?" "Set the stage," she said. "Give him a way to clear himself by talking." "And if he doesn't?" Miss Marple adjusted the lid of her basket. "Then I shall." That evening Miss Marple hosted a quiet tea in her sitting-room, inviting only 3 guests: Peter Denham, Nora Braithwaite, and Jenny Leach. It was, as she described it, a gathering of those who had a difficult view of that terrible afternoon. Nora arrived first, pale but calmer. Jenny followed with a tin of oat biscuits and a nervous energy that made her twitch each time the clock ticked. Denham arrived last, hands in his coat pockets, eyes sharp behind his spectacles. Miss Marple poured tea, offered jam cake, and spoke of inconsequential things for nearly 10 minutes before gently shifting the conversation. "I've been thinking about how that green tumbler changed hands," she said, stirring her tea. "Curious how a single object could connect so many people." Denham said nothing. Jenny tilted her head. "I suppose it could have ended up in anyone's hands." "Oh, yes," Miss Marple said lightly, "including Nora's uncle. If the glass had remained where Nora left it, Colonel Braithwaite might have been the one to drink the poison." Denham glanced sideways, but his face remained neutral. "It might have caused quite a scandal," Miss Marple continued. "The Colonel, a former trustee of the Collingridge estate, suddenly dying just as a man claiming to be Jonathan Collingridge arrives in the village." Still, Denham didn't move. "But of course," Miss Marple said softly, "that's not what happened, because someone made sure Julian drank from that glass. Someone who didn't want him to contest the inheritance. Someone who had more to lose than even the Colonel." "Silence. Isn't that right, Mr. Denham?" Denham set his cup down, the sound sharp against the saucer. "Are you accusing me, Miss Marple?" "No," she said gently. "I believe you'll do that yourself." Nora and Jenny stared in stunned silence as Denham stood. "You've no proof." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "You logged the tincture. You prepared it. You had access to the refreshments table before Jenny arrived. And more importantly, you had the most to lose if Julian spoke to the authorities." Denham opened his mouth, then closed it again. Miss Marple folded her hands. "You knew he'd found the original will, that he had a claim. But you also knew your brother had hidden certain documents. Julian threatened exposure, and you panicked. You prepared the poison and hoped the green glass would find its way to him. But when Nora intervened, you nearly failed." Denham's composure cracked. "He should have left it alone," he snapped. "No one even remembered him. What was the point of dragging it all back up? For what? A ruined name? Bankrupt estates? Lives undone? Justice?" Miss Marple said simply. "It may be late, Mr. Denham, but it is not optional. At that moment, Inspector Dunning stepped from the kitchen doorway, having overheard every word. Peter Denham paled. "You won't get far," Dunning said, voice quiet. "And I think you know that." There was no struggle. Denham sat back down, his shoulders slumping, as if he had finally decided to stop holding something up. Later that evening, after the constable had led Denham away and the door had closed behind him, Miss Marple returned to her armchair. Nora stood by the fire, still trembling. "He was right," she whispered. "It would have ruined everything." "But it didn't," Miss Marple replied. "It revealed everything." "And what happens now?" "Now," Miss Marple said, "we tell the truth, even if it's been buried for decades. And perhaps, dear, you begin again with your name restored, not someone else's. Stolen inheritance." Nora nodded, a tear rolling down her cheek. "And Mr. Northwood?" she asked. "Will they remember him as Jonathan?" "They will," Miss Marple said, "and I imagine in time someone will even plant a tree in his name, just outside the old Elmsley House ruins." She smiled softly. "After all, nothing lies quiet forever." Chapter 8. The Riddle Resolved. The following morning, a pale sun filtered over Maple Hollow, glinting on dew-laced hedgerows and gilding the ivy-covered chimneys like a benediction. To the casual observer, the village had returned to its usual calm. But those who knew it best understood the truth. The air held something else now, a silence thick with resolution, the hush that follows revelation. Miss Marple, as always, rose early, fed the birds outside her window, and set a fresh pot of tea on the hob. But instead of attending to her mending or collecting herbs in the garden, she sat at her writing table with a fresh sheet of notepaper and the quiet purpose of a woman preparing to record an ending she had long anticipated. The previous night had seen the arrest of Peter Denham and the quiet confession that followed, a confession that had shocked those who had trusted him most. The man who had provided cough syrup to toddlers, eye drops to the elderly, and warm advice with every prescription had, it turned out, harboured far more bitter compounds beneath the counter than the bottles on his shelves ever suggested. Crucis studiumte kunst. Motive was both old and tangled. Years ago, Denham's elder brother Roger had been a junior solicitor involved in the dissolution of the Collingridge estate after the suspicious disappearance of young Jonathan, later known to Maple Hollow as Julian Northwood. When Julian resurfaced, armed with old documents and intent on correcting a decades-old injustice, Peter Denham had seen not only the end of his family's reputation, but also the collapse of a financial arrangement that had long kept him quietly prosperous. Julian had uncovered letters, names, a second will, all of it enough to challenge the Braithwaite inheritance and potentially reopen the scandal of Elmsley House. The only way to silence him, Denham reasoned, was to ensure he never spoke again. But poison, as Miss Marple often reflected, is rarely tidy. It drips beyond its intended victim. And the green tumbler, meant to deliver justice in secret, had instead revealed it in full. Inspector Dunning returned just before midday to deliver the official confirmation. "He's confessed," Dunning said simply, setting his hat on the side table. "Said he'd been keeping monkshood in alcohol since spring. Claimed it was just a botanical experiment, until Julian Northwood arrived." Miss Marple poured the tea. And Nora? She'll be spared. Denham admitted she never knew what was in the glass, only that her uncle was in danger. Miss Marple nodded. She'll carry the guilt nonetheless. Dunning leaned back with a sigh. It's a strange business, isn't it? Man comes back to claim his name, and ends up dead in a field of sponge cakes and bunting. Stranger still, Miss Marple said, that it took his death to bring the truth to light. She paused, then added quietly, Some riddles don't want to be solved, Inspector. They prefer to be buried with polite smiles and tidy hedgerows. Dunning gave a dry chuckle. But you don't let them stay that way. Miss Marple smiled faintly. No, I don't suppose I do. That afternoon the village gathered at St. Mildred's for a brief service in Julian's memory. It was simple, attended by few. Just Miss Marple, Nora Braithwaite, Jenny Leach, Reverend Lyon, and 2 visiting officials from the Crown Solicitor's Office who had come to verify the new documentation Julian had sent by post before his death. Miss Marple sat near the back. She didn't cry, but when the hymn played, Abide with Me, she closed her eyes and listened to the voices, thin and trembling, echo across the nave like leaves stirred by wind. Afterward, Nora approached her in the graveyard. Beneath the ancient yew tree, they've agreed to amend the family record, she said. His name will go back in the Bible, Jonathan Collingridge. Miss Marple nodded. Good, that's where he belongs. Nora hesitated. And me? You, Miss Marple said gently, belong to the present, not the past. A tear slipped down Nora's cheek, and she turned to go. Miss Marple remained for a few more minutes, studying the sky through the blackened branches above. Then she made her way home. That evening, she sat in her parlour with the fire low and her notebook open. One last time, she turned to the final page and wrote, Riddle at Maple Hollow. Solved Jonathan Collingridge, rightful heir, silenced. Peter Denham, guardian of a lie. Truth uncovered by a teacup and a forgotten will, then, in smaller letters beneath, Justice, delayed, but not denied. She closed the book and placed it back in the drawer with the others. Outside the evening deepened into mist. Somewhere in the distance a bird sang once, then was still. Miss Marple reached for her teacup, took a sip, and smiled. Chapter 9. The Quiet. Unsettling, though the murderer had confessed, and the legal wheels had begun to turn, the village of Maple Hollow did not return to its former rhythm right away. There was a stillness now, an absence in the air that lingered, like the hush following a long, low peal of thunder. People went about their days, of course. The baker still opened on time, the vicar still called upon the elderly, and children still raced down the green lanes after school. But the gossip, so vigorous in the week after Julian Northwood's death, had softened into something quieter, something wary. Miss Marple, however, remained as composed as ever. Yet even she sensed the shift. For while the culprit had been revealed, and justice set in motion, there were still unsettled things, questions not quite asked, truths not fully processed. She could feel it in the hesitance of Nora Braithwaite's footsteps when she passed by, and in the way Jenny Leach's laughter came half a second too late at the tea shop. Truth, she knew well, was not an ending. It was a mirror, and not everyone liked the reflection. On the third day after the arrest, a letter arrived at Miss Marple's cottage. It was hand-delivered with no return address, written in a careful script she did not recognize. The envelope was pale grey, the ink faintly smudged. She opened it delicately. Miss Marple, you may believe the story has ended, but I assure you it has not. There are more names you do not know, more records burned than you imagine. Julian Northwood was only the first to speak. He will not be the last, and those who silenced him still have voices. Beware the past. It never stays buried. A witness, Miss Marple, read it 3 times, then folded it once, precisely, and tucked it into her notebook beneath the heading, Aftermath. She sat silently, for a moment her expression unreadable. Not fear, not surprise, but a quiet, tightening awareness. Someone, somewhere, had not finished playing the game. That afternoon she made her way to St. Mildred's again, not for a service, but to speak privately with Reverend Lyon. The vicar received her with concern, after seeing her expression. "I hoped it was over," he said, pouring her a cup of tea. "It may be," Miss Marple replied, "but sometimes endings are only quieter beginnings." She showed him the letter. He read it twice, his brow creasing deeper with each pass. "Do you think it's a threat?" "I think it's a reminder," she said calmly, "that even when truth comes to light, the shadows don't retreat. They simply change their shape." The vicar sat back. "What will you do?" "Nothing. For now." Her voice was steady. "Let the past stir if it must, but we'll be ready if it dares to rise again." At dusk, Nora Braithwaite appeared at Miss Marple's door. "I saw someone," she said breathlessly. "Last night, near the old Elmsley gate." Miss Marple ushered her inside. "Who?" "I'm not sure. They were standing just beyond the hedge, watching the house, watching me. Did they say anything?" "No, but they left something." From her coat pocket, Nora pulled a single yellowed photograph. It was brittle at the corners, and the image had faded, but the face was unmistakable. Jonathan Collingridge, younger, smiling, standing beside a man whose face had been scratched out with deliberate, angry strokes. "There's writing on the back," Nora whispered. Miss Marple turned the photo over. 4 words, written in the same script as the letter. He wasn't alone. That night, Miss Marple sat up late, the photograph beside her, the fire down to embers. Her knitting remained untouched. Her thoughts churned quietly beneath her calm exterior. Jonathan, had returned to Maple Hollow not just to reclaim a name, but to uncover a wider truth. And someone else had come with him, or followed him, or waited until he arrived, someone who still hadn't been found. She opened her notebook and turned to a fresh page. Chapter unfinished. Second figure, hidden. Photograph, Yunshu, clue. She underlined the last phrase, circled the words who was in the photograph, and why erase him? The answers would come. They always did. Chapter 10. The name beneath the ink. The morning that followed was golden and windless, one of those deceptively peaceful English mornings where birdsong floats on the air and secrets cling stubbornly to the hedgerows. Miss Marple, after a quiet breakfast, placed the photograph on her writing table and examined it one last time under a magnifying lens. The scratched-out face beside Jonathan Collingridge had been obscured with purpose, but not enough. The jawline remained, a partial ear, and most telling of all, a signet ring worn on the right hand. She jotted a single note in the margin of her notebook. Braithwaite family crest. Same ring, but not the Colonel. It hadn't been Colonel Braithwaite in the photo. It had been his younger brother Edward, a name that hadn't been spoken in years. That afternoon, she walked to the parish archives once more, claiming she was reviewing documents for the Historical Society's summer issue. Reverend Lyon, accustomed to her gentle intrusions, granted her full access. She requested the Braithwaite family file. It wasn't thick, but it held what she needed: school records, minor citations, a few faded photographs. Edward Braithwaite had been a naval officer, dismissed quietly and sent abroad following a family dispute with his elder brother. A name scrubbed from village memory, but not from the past. The pieces clicked into place. Edward Braithwaite had been close to the Collingridges, too close. He and Jonathan had been friends, perhaps more. And when the will changed, when young Jonathan had been erased, Edward had not stood against it. He had vanished, and now Miss Marple was sure he had returned. That evening, she invited Nora and Inspector Dunning to tea. The fire was lit. The tea was strong. The photograph lay between them on the table, unspoken but humming with meaning. "He's still here," Miss Marple said quietly. Whoever scratched out the photo knew its power, knew it could link him to Julian, and he left it for Nora, not to threaten, but to warn her. Dunning frowned. Warn her of what? That the truth wasn't yet finished. She turned to Nora. "Do you remember anyone who seemed unusually interested in you lately? Anyone asking about your uncle or Elmsley?" Nora shook her head. "Think carefully." Nora hesitated. "There was a man," she said, "a few weeks ago, at the church garden. He said he was new to the county. Asked about the ruins. Did he give a name?" She shook her head. "Only that he once lived near here. Said it was like stepping through fog to return." Miss Marple stood. "We must go to the ruins." By dusk, the three of them had arrived at the overgrown shell of Elmsley House. Weeds curled through what remained of the old gates. The east wing had collapsed in on itself. All that stood was a single scorched staircase and the chapel, long locked. But the door was open. They entered slowly, the air cool and stale. Candles, fresh ones, lined the small altar, and there he was, an older man, slight in frame, silver, at the temples dressed plainly. He turned as they entered, and for a moment time folded back on itself. Nora gasped. "He looks like Julian," Miss Marple said softly. But it wasn't Julian. It was Edward Braithwaite. "I suppose," he said quietly, "you've come to arrest me." Inspector Dunning said nothing. Miss Marple stepped forward instead. "You left that photograph." Edward nodded. "I couldn't let him die in silence, not after what I failed to do all those years ago." "You were there when they erased him," she said, "when they buried the will." I was young and afraid, and I let my brother do what he pleased. But I kept everything, every letter, every proof. I've sent it to the solicitor. It's all there." Miss Marple studied him. "Why hide now?" He looked away. "Because I am what let it happen. I didn't poison him, but I allowed his erasure. Twice. And that, miss, Marple is not something one easily stands trial for. Dunning stepped forward. If you're not responsible for the death, you're not under arrest. But I am responsible, Edward whispered, for the silence that made the murder possible. There was a long pause. Then Miss Marple said, gently, "And now you've broken that silence." In the weeks that followed, the documents Edward sent led to a reopening of the Collingridge case. Julian Northwood was legally recognised as Jonathan Collingridge posthumously. The inheritance was placed in trust, to be administered by an independent party. The Braithwaite estate, though diminished in scandal, was not seized. Nora, to the surprise of many, chose to remain in Maple Hollow. "I think I'd like to start fresh," she said one morning over tea. "No secrets, no ghosts." "A wise idea," Miss Marple replied, "though the ghosts will linger. It's their way, but they lose their strength once the truth is spoken." And as for Edward Braithwaite, he left the county, quietly, alone. His departure was not mourned, but nor was it cursed. In the end, justice had not come with drama. It had arrived quietly, like fog-lifting. 1 week later, Miss Marple sat once more in her parlour, tea beside her, notebook open. She turned to the last page and wrote, "The Riddle at Maple Hollow. Complete. Justice found not in fury, but in the silence that followed. Then in the margin, some truths take decades, but they always come." She closed the book, tied the string around the envelope, and placed it on the shelf beside her other cases. The clock chimed. Outside, a bird sang in the hedgerow, and inside, Miss Marple sipped her tea and smiled, just faintly.